Good evening. I'm Jeremy Hobson, co-host of Here and Now on WBUR and NPR. Welcome to the Sci Performance Center at Boston University and to Fast Forward, a conversation with David Carr and Jill Abramson. They'll be talking tonight about the future of media, where we'll get our information, and how we'll manage the sometimes overwhelming volume of it. But first, I'll be talking a bit myself with our first guest, the newly installed Andrew R. Lack Professor in the BU College of Communication, the author of The Night of the Gun. A reporter investigates the darkest story of his life, his own, and the media columnist and culture reporter for the New York Times. Please welcome David Carr. Hi, David.
Hi, Jeremy.
If there is a student in this audience, I'm sure that there are many, who has gone into print journalism, what would you tell them about what the future of that is going to be? Are newspapers going to exist in 10, 20 years the way that they do now as a profession for journalists?
If there's a student in the audience who's majoring in print journalism, I'd probably tell them to switch to something more forward-looking, like blacksmithing, for instance. We kid because we love, okay? There is very much a place in journalism for the person who can create and array a 400 to 1,000 word piece of copy that's clean, that tells you something you don't know. That's a fungible skill that will, it's a movable feast that should transport to many different realms. I'm kind of a print bull in part because it's how I eat. It's how I get hamburgers, is working at a newspaper. I do think that there is print value in that it has the ability to convey, you know, if you have an iPad and you're reading something, you see that person like on an airplane or a bus, you know that they've got $400 to spare. But if you see them reading an issue of The Economist, you know something else about them. I think people will continue to want to, in certain instances, to use print as a kind of intellectual jewelry and a way of showing others.
People all over the country, people in small towns the way that they do now, or people just in New York and Washington and Boston and LA?
Well, oddly enough, in small towns, the print press is doing pretty well. If you're running a community paper where, let's say, the kind that puts your daughter's soccer game in, you're probably doing all right, because you can't take a web page and get it up on the fridge, right? When they show your daughter's soccer team. So those guys have done pretty well. Larger papers like us, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, done okay. It's the middle parts that have been really clobbered, the great regional papers that have been really hurt, but you can't count them out. I spent the weekend reading the Boston Globe, which, you know, you heard all this stuff about how deep a hole they were working from. Pretty damn good paper. I mean, every section front, and you know, partly because Boston's an interesting town, but partly because of the women and men working there. I don't know, I really enjoyed the heck out of reading the paper.
But do you think that that's going to be around like that 10, 20 years from now?
I think 10 years from now, the print will be a luxury artifact that will cost a lot more, will have much higher production values, that organizations like mine, the Boston Globe, all the way down to smaller papers, will use the web as their primary vehicle for news, and hopefully through things like the metered model and subscription models, come up with a way to form a business model out of digital. It's tough because advertising on the web just continues to drop in terms of its value. There's always more of it. There's no scarcity like there is in print.
What has been the biggest surprise for you in the media and how it's changed? Something you didn't see coming, maybe even something that if you were to go back now, you wish you would be able to do a story about it before it showed up, but you and others missed it. What would be the biggest surprise?
Almost every week brings things I had no idea was coming. People always, come and talk to us about the future of media, and I'm like, I have no clue about what's going to happen next. If you said to me a couple years ago, yeah, Jeff Bezos is going to buy the Washington Post. What? And then Pierre Omidyar, the guy who started eBay, is going to put in $250 million to newspapers, not to newspapers, but to a web product. So $500 million coming out of Silicon Valley toward traditional hard news. Or if you told me even this week, HBO and CBS are going to start streaming their programming over the web after they've made millions and millions of dollars working within the cable bundle. The future, change comes very slowly, and then it happens all at once. So I'm stunned by so much of what's going on. I've kind of gotten out of the future business. I have trouble keeping up with the present.
Well, let's talk about the present then for a second. One of the things that I know from personal experience exists in almost every newsroom is a series of televisions up on the wall showing the cable news channels 24 hours a day. Do you think that they have an outsized influence on the media because they're kind of the video wire service now that we all rely on to keep up to date with the latest of what's happening?
I can't think of a time in history when cable news has had less of an influence on what's going on with the news cycle. You have to think about, what is the value of the front page of the New York Times? If you think about it, in your mythical 10 years from now, if you say to a kid, yeah, we used to call a full stop to the news cycle, and we'd pick out the 6 or 7 most important stories, smush them onto a piece of paper, roll them up, and then throw them in people's yards. That never happened. What are you talking about? More and more what you're seeing is newspapers have become daily magazines, and what they're doing, I know everything that happened today. It went whooshing by me on Twitter, on Facebook, on a variety of websites. But I really don't know what was important or why. And that sense of hierarchy and organization, the curation that occurs with a print artifact is important. In terms of cable news, I mean, right now they don't know where to look. The world is ending everywhere you look. So, it's like, Ebola, they're going to get you here. Ukraine, things are blowing up over there. We're on the march in Syria. You just have to have your head on a swivel. They don't really know where they're going, let alone setting an agenda. That we're all being pushed around by a ferocious news cycle right now. Pretty dark one, by the way.
Because of the news.
Yeah, the news is crazy right now.
But what about how they're handling it? The idea that all day long we're seeing every tick of the Ebola story, something that, as has been pointed out multiple times, has only killed 1 person in the United States. Is that lack of context on their part, or is that just the news cycle?
Well, I think that I'd be hard-pressed to say that maybe we're not paying the right kind of attention to Ebola, but I can't say that we're paying too much, because at ground zero in the Ebola, you could watch the marble roll slowly off the table, and mistakes have been made in the U.S., and all it takes is a series of mistakes, and the footprint grows. So I'm not for fear-mongering. I don't look for me to be walking around with a surgical mask anytime soon. But in terms of I think for once the media franticness, if not the tenor of the coverage, at least the amount of it is warranted.
Who is doing a great job in media right now? What organization do you think is just doing things exactly as they should?
No one. I mean, if maybe God's making a newspaper that I don't see, or maybe the Virgin Mary has a website that I haven't checked out. But in terms of perfection, I think what's happening is over and over is we're able as consumers to produce and arrange our own news feed, and it's never been a better time to. I mean, let's say that Vice is doing a good job. They had that embedded story out of ISIS. That comes toward me. And then our early both video and text reporting out of West Africa, I thought was really important and impressive. And let's say that Wall Street Journal is doing a good job in the Ukraine, which they have done. We're able to put together the Bow ideal of what is a newspaper. The problem is you never get to the end of it. You never feel like you're caught up. You don't close the newspaper and set it aside. It just continues to whoosh by.
David Carr, thank you very much.
An absolute pleasure. It is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and former colleague, Jill Abramson. Jill began her career at the Harvard Independent, right across the river. Went on to Time Magazine, was a reporter at the American Lawyer, was the editor of Legal Times. What am I doing?
They told me to come out.
They did? You're sneaking up on me, by all means. No. Come and sit.
I'll just
You're my-
politely grin as you.
Well, I'm going to shine your apple here a little bit and see how great you are. This is going to be a little embarrassing for you. You know what? You can correct me if you were the editor-in-chief of Legal Times, check. You were at the Wall Street Journal for a decade as a senior reporter, mostly investigative, and then right?
Yeah.
And as a deputy bureau chief. You came to the New York Times in 2000.
No. In 1997.
1997 became the New York Times Washington bureau chief in 2000. And then ended up serving as managing editor under Bill Keller, our mutual friend. In that time, you took on the federal government over some big stories. You were run over by a truck. Is that true?
That is true.
That is true. You wrote a book about your dog.
I did.
After becoming executive editor of the paper in 2011, the paper won 8 Pulitzers. And then last May, you were replaced by Dean Baquet, correct? Ladies and gentlemen, it is my deep honor to introduce my friend and colleague, smarter than most, tougher than the rest, Jill Abramson. I really do think it's swell. You came out, dashed over from teaching at Harvard, like you finished your class at 7.
I did.
Are you tired
4
of
to
talking?
7. Well, because I knew I was joining you, David,
Oh.
I particularly planned my class so that I spoke less than usual, and I encouraged my students to talk much more. I played Professor Kingsfield and did a little calling on people.
What are you enjoying teaching?
I love it.
It's undergrads, right?
It's undergrads. I teach in the English department.
And what are you teaching them?
I'm teaching them about journalism and great narrative nonfiction writing.
Do you ever sort of look at the news cycle, the one that's been going on, I think, for a couple of years? and just say, what's next? Locusts? What else bad could happen?
Seeing Richard Preston's byline in the new New Yorker was just like exactly that. I mean, he's covered every pestilence there is and writes very gripingly about it, but there he was writing about Ebola in the New Yorker.
When
I thought you were going to ask me, do I look at it with disgust? And I heard you were kind of asked a question just a few minutes ago about sort of what your reaction to the media coverage of Ebola has been. And just as I'm now a consumer of the news and a teacher of journalism, but I mean, it's been, I think, disgraceful in many respects. I have to roll my eyes when, like today, I'm reading all these stories about the panic. Well, who helped cause the panic? I mean, please.
But when you say that, are you saying there is an overreaction, or there should be an overreaction?
No, there is an overreaction.
But people are scared.
Well, people are scared in part because of the ceaseless, ominous cable TV and other coverage, which stokes all their fears.
When
2 people are sick and 1 person has died.
right.
That's what's happened. In the United States, obviously, I'm not talking about coverage of the disease in West Africa. That, is a very serious, tragic epidemic that is shredding, the many lives in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and elsewhere. But I'm talking about the coverage about, it's coming here.
Well,
Come on.
Well, it's
You
falling
didn't
into
You didn't
it.
give a straight answer to that question. He didn't.
The thing is, it's falling into a media milieu where when there's not Ebola, it's like, next up, your couch can kill you. Here's how.
Right.
And now there is an actual menace, so people are, what you're saying is not really a menace per se. So in terms of...
I'm not saying it couldn't become one. I'm just saying when you're talking about proportionality, which I think is important in terms of how things are covered, it's just out of whack right now.
But Jill, here's what I think's driving it is we've come to believe that our government doesn't know what it's doing, almost never. And we don't trust them. We don't trust them to handle it. We're going to do, the president has a really bold, grand plan to ensure everybody, and the thing rolls out and just face plants. It doesn't work.
Yeah, and now the computers are working and lots of people are signing up, and where's all the big coverage of that story?
Yeah, but
Yeah. See, I can now speak my mind. It's very liberating.
I was deeply afraid of that. But the thing is if you concentrate on the faceplant coming out of the gate, that kind of pratfall on this kind of issue would have more serious consequences. If we don't trust the government to keep us safe, people are prone to panic.
Well, I mean, that is a fair point, but I do think that the, round-the-clock cable TV coverage of this with the ominous music in the background has certainly helped contribute to unnecessary panic.
I think you have won this point about 4 times, so I'm going to move on. One of the things that, when's the last time you taught? You taught at Princeton?
I taught at Princeton for a year. I taught at Yale for 5 years until I became executive editor in 2011. Arthur Sulzberger Jr. asked me not to, I mean, he was completely reasonable and right that the job of executive editor was a full-time position and needed my full attention. So I stopped when I became executive editor.
Is it fun to be back in the classroom?
Totally fun, but I went to Harvard as an undergraduate, and as silly as this is going to sound, sometimes I'm walking around the campus and I'm not sure if I'm 20 or 60. I mean, I know I'm 60, but inside my head, I can just feel exactly the way I did when I was agonizing over whether to remain a medieval history and literature major.
And how did that turn out? What did you do?
I switched.
And the world benefited, clearly. I'm always, when I'm on campus, any campus, I'm terrified somebody's going to jump out and say, because it took me 7 years to get out of college, that they're going to say, you know what, there's a hold on your transcript. You never graduated.
I thought that's everybody's nightly dream.
Right.
There's a math test, and it's hopeless. And then you're sitting naked at your exam desk. Doesn't everybody have that dream?
Can you see into my head right now? The thing is, it does take, for like, you've done some teaching, I've done some guest teaching, but the other day, I was a little late for class, and I came running down toward the class, and somebody said, oh, look, the professor's here, and like everybody else, I turned and looked.
Right. Who?
Who
could
are
that
they
be?
talking about? The thing that has been stunning to me is the level of seriousness that my students are bringing to the work at hand. I mean, people, there's a lot to worry about in the world, maybe some of it overhyped, but I think worrying about this next generation is a waste of time. I think they got it going on.
I think, here at, BU and at Harvard, I mean, we're so privileged to be teaching the brightest students in our country, and I would agree with you. I think we would find a bigger challenge, the two of us trying to share our passion for great journalism, if we were teaching, for instance, at night at a community college where all of our students had to have full-time jobs as well as take class. Not that they wouldn't be serious, but I just think it's really challenging to be taking college courses for a lot of students and other places.
I couldn't agree more. And trying to fit bolt in an education, not get buried by the student loans. I think the American dream is a lot more complicated to execute these days than it used to be. And what are you going to graduate out to? One of the, but I mean, the sense of responsibility. How old, the woman that won the Nobel, 17 years old?
Right. I got into a little bit of trouble on this
Who gave you
subject.
trouble about that?
Well, David and I, it turned out that we didn't see each other. We're at the same party last Saturday night after the New Yorker Festival. I was on a very weighty panel called Dogs versus Cats. With
It's got
all
its
of
own
the problems of the world. I'm very happy to report that Team Dogs won.
You had a better set of facts, let's face it.
So I have to admit, I was flush with victory at this party and had a few cocktails. And when I was executive editor of the Times, I was very careful about what I would say in public. And if I still had that job, I think I would have avoided the following situation, which is after the several cocktails. I was on my way out to go home.
Having had
and-
several adult beverages.
Yes. And a reporter for New York Magazine said to me, "Can I just ask you a few questions?" There was only one right answer to that, which was no. But that was not the answer that I gave. I said, sure. And first question was easy peasy, which should have been my alert. The second question was, as you know, Malala just won the Nobel Peace Prize, and she is 17. What were you doing when you were 17? And I didn't really have to think about it long. I said, I was smoking pot at Bethesda Fountain. That's what I was doing when I was 17. But so where were you going, David, with your question about the Nobel Prize?
What I was going to say is I was doing something altogether different when I was 17, which is playing frisbee and smoking pot when I was 17. I just think that this generation of, and I don't want to generalize, I'm sure there's mopes and lazies, and that these guys come to play. Like they're so serious in part by they're confronted by a media environment where they have to say absolutely plugged in. When you and I were working together, I can remember, I think it was when Politico announced that they were going to do Capital, which was a New York branch of their, and it was after a week of, God knows what, a lot of stuff happening. And you just, well, there was so much going on in the media space, and you just looked at me and said, it all comes so fast.
It does, and you, I thought, wrote a wonderful column today where you made that point right at the top, that we think change happens in an evolutionary way, in an orderly way, and that actually things can seem stable, and then they change totally very suddenly. And that was the point you're making, which I think is really true, and that sometimes things are changing so quickly and dramatically that while you are experiencing it or trying to work through it, or in my former job, trying to lead through it, you don't really recognize the profound impact of many of those changes in real time, and that's where you can get bitten.
Yeah, because what you're trying to do is just swing from vine to vine and keep up. Meanwhile, there's big tectonic changes occurring underneath. It was who told me that a long time ago was Steve Jobs. Change comes very slowly,
And then all
at once, and boom. And so, Netflix is around for a couple of years, and all of a sudden HBO and.
Well, we were chatting about a journalist, scholar named Clay Shirky a little earlier, and he made that point in a great essay he wrote a couple of years ago called Thinking the Unthinkable, and it was about newspapers, and that was his prediction. But the whole beginning of the piece is a very interesting discourse on Gutenberg and the advent of the printing press, and how in that time that changed everything, and people were slow to realize that. And his point was that the digital transition was probably as profound a development, and that we couldn't begin really a few years ago to understand its full impact.
Well, part of what happened was our barrier to entry, these monopolies we had, were built out of physical assets, printing presses,
Right.
trucks, agreements with Teamsters. And as soon as those barriers dropped, it's like the Huns were among us. I mean, I can remember when Ariana Huffington started out, and me and my famous friends are going to do a blog. And it's like, oh, that's adorable. You're going to do that. That's so cute that you're going to do that. I can remember being at her house and just head patting her and saying how cute that was. Within 5 years and for under $10 million, she built out a huge national brand, mostly by picking our pocket. But
Look at The Guardian in the U.S.
Right.
Went overnight from, I think, having 6 people working in the U.S. to, 100 now, and has a huge audience. That happened like that.
during your tenure, BuzzFeed starting up, right? And the
Well, as you recall, people at the Times were a little grumbly when I decided at the 2012 convention that we would do a joint project with BuzzFeed to live stream the conventions. And
Yeah,
people
8
were
months.
like, what? The New York Times is going to...
What is a BuzzFeed? What is a BuzzFeed? 8 months after they started, we were partnered with them, and it echoes a theme that we're living through, which is the so-called insurgent media and the establishment meeting.
Right, you were talking about Vice.
Marching toward each other. When they get money, they hire reporters. We've made every effort to make our product relevant on the phone. I want to step back a little bit. Now that you don't have to read anything other than your students' papers, you don't have.
I do have to read those.
You don't
And
have
it's
to
a
read
pleasure.
anything.
So what do I read?
What do you read, watch, listen to? Like you've been able to resume life as a civilian and read what you want.
Well, like in some ways, yesterday being Sunday, that's my appointment TV night. And I'm happy I'm back, committed to Homeland.
It's
And
back, isn't it?
It's back. It's about the work again, thank God, And
Good.
I've invested in the first 2 episodes of The Affair.
I'm with
so
you.
I'm steamed into that. So that's what I watched, last night. Starting
What
at
about
9.
zombies? What about The
No,
Walking Dead?
I don't like. I'm a reality based.
Yeah, but well, Walking Dead is it's like a Western. These lone Americans out on the frontier
But-
trying to avoid getting their faces chewed off. It's
Not my thing. No.
just checking. Zombies.
But, in the evening, and this is going to sound very eggheady to you, but I had some print publications that I hadn't gotten to, so I had my stack, and I spent 2 hours with the New York Review of Books, which I have to say I think is a perfect publication. It's so smart. The big piece in The Well was, Jed Pearl, who wrote this devastating but brilliantly written review of the Jeff Koons show at the Whitney, which I had gone to, but had the same reservations that he did about it. And, I just sat reading it for hours. It's so smart. I think Bob Silvers, for those of you who don't read the New York Review of Books, I think he is one of the great editors of our time, and it's fantastic. And if I was sort of robo-reading news for competitive reasons the way I used to, I never would have been able to spend that much time just luxuriating in it. And can I just pause, just because having done a shout out for Silvers, a sad thing while you and I are meeting here is that Ben Bradley is so very ill and near death. And he, in my book, is the most consequential editor of my lifetime, and just really am only thinking the best thoughts about him.
Will you just say a little bit more about that, because you ended up you hadn't had an amazing rise, and you were editing Legal Times at a fairly young age, and so you're saying he was something of a North Star for you. Why?
Because I think he made the Washington Post into an incredibly interesting and electric national publication of consequence. And I think, he was the bravest kind of editor during Watergate. I think I've been mulling over the fact that one of the big journalistic disasters happened on his watch at the Washington Post, the Janet Cook affair, where the Post won a Pulitzer Prize for a story that was a fabrication, and they had to return the prize. But it's so telling that, the Post newsroom stood by Ben. They loved him as much, I think, during that terrible time as they did during the triumphs of Watergate and others that came after. I think he got such a kick out of being the editor of the Post, and made it fun for everybody, and made it very consequential as well. And I love him.
Well, he was a movie-worthy version of editor.
Jason Robards.
Yeah,
So,
but
the real Ben Bradley was cooler than Jason
much cooler.
Robards.
Better shirt. I can remember seeing him as this dude from the Midwest, and I was editing Washington City paper, which had been a historical antagonist of the Washington Post. And he just came up to me and said, "I really love your paper whenever it doesn't have its finger in my eye." And just smiled at me, and he just loved the full contact of it.
Well, you wrote an interesting column just recently about the Post being on a comeback, which I think, in terms of what I read now, I'm spending more time with it.
Yeah, well, part of what's cool about it is we say what you want about print or even digital. It's a place where one person can land and kind of turn the boat. The assets are still in place, but I think of Tina Brown at the New Yorker, Adam Moss at New York Magazine.
Peter Kaplan.
Peter Kaplan, wherever he was. And it's a fun thing that when you get your hands on the steering wheel.
You don't have to tell me.
Yeah. As you know, we one of the great, I did this story about the Tribune while I was working for you, and you were the managing editor of the paper, and I wrote about a newspaper company, which people don't read about newspaper companies even more, and yet that story went bonkers. And you sent me a MASH note, which I still have on my wall in my cube, and what it said to me is, because I had asked you, why this one, why not the other ones? And you said, you wrote about the trashing of a once great American institution, and people never, ever tire of that story. And so it
also, revealed just shocking sexual harassment.
Yeah,
I
that
mean,
was a culture
that
of
was like
pathology.
the added, element of that story. It wasn't simply about a newspaper company. It was about, in the year, whatever it was, what was it? 2009?
A guy used employee stock options
But
to buy out a
it was just
newspaper.
shocking to me
Right.
it shouldn't have been, but it was.
But
I'm rereading right now a book by David Halberstam called The Powers That Be.
Wow.
It's incredibly good. I was so worried that upon rereading, it wasn't going to live up to what I remembered. But it's about 4 great media institutions at the zenith of their power. It's about CBS, Time, the Washington Post, and the LA Times. And the stuff about the LA Times is just fascinating. It really is. So it is a once great institution.
when I was, I liked making a newspaper with you. We had some fun,
Thank
right?
you, David.
I always felt that you had my back, which was important, and had a broad interest in a Catholic range of issues. It surprised me. So I already was an admirer of yours, but then when you got pushed out of your job, you
Just say fired, jeez.
thank you.
I was fired.
When you were fired out of your job, I just thought it was a rule that you would smile and wear beige and never use that word that you just used rather declaratively. And people talk about leaning into this or that, but that's a pile of crap right there. That's a big hatchet aimed right at you. And I know you got run over by a truck and kept moving and got up and ran a newspaper, but your willingness to just kind of tilt into that, own it, and keep moving. I mean, is that just a decision you made, or that's who you are?
I think it's partly who I am, but I felt that I had devoted my career to telling the truth, and the truth was that I was fired. So it just seemed, what else? I wasn't going to. My kids are 31 and 29. I wasn't going to say, like, I've decided to step down to spend more time with my family. I mean, no.
They're not in favor of it, but I'm doing it anyway. Actually, I know your son will. I wouldn't mind spending a little more time with him.
That's been one of the joys of having more time these past
But what about
months.
I think everybody dreams about sort of, I'm going to step off the Hobbit wheel for a second, and will it be like? But then you worry, well, what if the bell rings and I totally freak out and I'm not in the thick of it? Has there been any of that?
Is the question, have I freaked out?
No, the question is, when news heats up and you don't have
I miss it, sure.
what parts?
Well, just I see, I still read just as I always did. I see big stories that jump out at me that are not being covered. The chase, first and foremost. I mean, I love big news stories. I don't feel like, gee, I wish I was like running Ebola coverage. I don't. That should be obvious. But there are certain things that I don't want to say what they are, because I'm actually thinking about, getting back into some writing and reporting.
Okay, now we're getting somewhere. This is what everybody, I think it's important you show a little leg about where you're going. Let's make some news, Jill Abramson.
Well, I am very seriously thinking about joining, it's sort of back to the future for me, joining Steve Burrell, who you know.
Yes.
And we actually are pitching a startup that will be
There it
very,
is.
like, not unsurprisingly, like very ambitious, killer journalism. We're talking to some investors who are sounding very interested, and we are going to do great stories and offer great journalists actually money that they can live on to write something wonderful for us.
Get on your Twitters. So are you gonna type or type on a keyboard composed of human beings? Are you gonna run something, or are you gonna do your
I'm
own?
going to try and do both, because we're not trying to start like a whole magazine or a full website. We're talking about doing a discrete number of great pieces, and I would be involved in recruiting the writers, in helping edit and conceptualize the stories. And Steve won the National Magazine Award this past year for a
Lifetime Achievement.
for a great story he did on healthcare costs.
Oh yeah, for Time.
For Time. And he and I are both gonna do one big story a year.
Wow, and so you've discovered a business model will pay for.
We think we have.
Have you created cold fusion at the same
Yes,
time?
indeed.
Any hints on the name?
We're still wrestling with that. Steve said it's too obscure. As you can tell from my love of things like the New York Review of Books, I was very taken. I wanted to revive the name McClure's.
Oh, sweet.
But Steve is like, no one will remember that now.
When Steve talks about that stuff, people listen. I think it's time to bring Jeremy back out.
Oh,
Now
sure.
that we've made a tad of news, and Jeremy's going to channel some of your questions, and maybe he'll have a couple of his own.
Actually, I want to pick up on what was just talked about. When you make news like that in a group like this, did you think about that beforehand, or was that just spur of the moment? I'm going to tell them all right now.
I thought about it beforehand.
Uh-huh.
Now, just a sec, could we just, under
What?
ferocious and sustained questioning, she eventually collapsed and admitted.
Well,
I know you thought of it before, Jill.
So-
That's okay.
so I guess that makes some of these questions irrelevant that came in, but I'm going to ask you one anyway that came in about this. Would you go back to the New York Times if they asked you nicely? That was tweeted.
It would depend as what?
It would depend on what?
It would depend on as what?
To what extent did sexism play a role in your dismissal from the New York Times?
I'll let David take that one.
Well, I thought it was interesting that I got to be careful, obviously. I just want to observe that I heard a lot about Jill Abramson from a distance when I was a reporter, a young reporter in the Midwest, and then as I went to Washington and in New York. And I had personal experience in that when Howell Raines was the editor of the New York Times, he would send people down to the Washington Bureau to do stories when you were running the Washington Bureau. And we called them Howell Says. Howell Says, and I came to you with one of these stories, and you just were like, really? And I thought to myself, I heard a lot about you all my career. I had limited, but I never heard mention much of your gender until the end. The history of it.
Oh, that's ridiculous, David. It's just ridiculous because, I mean, a huge deal was made when I was made executive editor.
That's what I'm talking
the first
about.
woman in history.
Yeah.
And when I became Washington bureau chief, that I was the first woman to have that job, and I was the first woman to be managing editor. So please don't say it was only recently that my gender
I meant
was
that
emphasized.
it was a footprint in history when you got your job, that it came up a lot. I knew I was going to get in trouble on that question. I just would have let it float away.
Someone writes, also for you, Jill, in an October opinion piece in the New York Times, it cited a University of Southern California neuroscientist saying that when under stress, women make better decisions than men. Would you agree?
You know, there are so many studies that say, you know, every manner of things. I have no idea. I think making decisions under a lot of stress is difficult for everybody, and you do the best you can.
At the New York Times, and I'll throw this to either of you, who are the main competitors? Who do you think about in the media landscape as your main competitors at the Times?
Well, by the end of my time at the Times, any big story that was getting a lot of attention and a lot of links and a lot of pickup on social media. I mean, I don't mean, you know, every stray piece of Kim Kardashian news, but you know, stories of consequence that hit, I would know about, and that was my competition. I had ceased to think of my competition as other newsrooms or news organizations. Competition came from everywhere.
Yeah, didn't it, right? On the web, I think news, if you have news, anyone will point at you if it's real news. And so if it's an NFL player beating up his girlfriend, nobody says, well, that was on TMZ. They don't say that anymore. They just run as fast as they can because TMZ had the original document. I do think the playing field is leveled to the point where, you know, on cultural matters, I think we feel heat from Vulture, from New York Magazine. We can on certain political stories. Maybe the trouble will come from political, but maybe it's BuzzFeed. You never know. I have been beaten on the media beat by Gawker, just clobbered. They can move sometimes so much quicker and so much faster. And the whole thing about, well, they were first and we'll be better. Sometimes you only get one crack at the consumer, and then it's old news. And for a while, we used to make a living on step backs, but I don't think that works as well anymore.
What about NPR?
Well, I think that NPR has been stalwart in international reporting when other organizations have pulled back in significant ways. NPR continues to be there to do important work, to have men and women in the field that do stuff. Domestically, sometimes I feel that we're setting their agenda more so than the other way around.
I just taught the class that I just came from. I had my students read and immerse themselves in the Whitey Bulger timeline and documents that WBUR and the Atavist collaborated on. Fantastic.
So there you go. WBUR gets the.
The other thing I would say is the ability of podcasts now to, much like the DVR, to pull the bundle apart and people start to program their own universe. Like I'm deeply into Serial, which is Sarah Koenig's multi-part series on a single murder, and she's going from week to week to week, and the story is gradually unfolding, and it's very old school. I mean, that's what Edgar Allan Poe used to do that, but in radio, it works really well. And in terms of innovating the form, as soon as it stops, I can't wait for the next one.
This was asked in a couple of different ways on Twitter. Why isn't there a louder BS alarm among national media reporters? Why don't people call lies lies when they see them as lies?
This is the whole thing about false equivalency that we always get clobbered on, that we say, we on the one hand, on the other, we quote both sides, when in fact people are convinced that there is a one true set of facts.
Yeah, I know. I guess I will plead not guilty and remind the audience without seeming like a self-serving jerk that I wrote with Jane Mayer a book called Strange Justice, which said very clearly that Clarence Thomas lied. There was no false equivalency. So I think when you do the necessary investigative reporting and really deliver the definitive backstory based on reporting, the weight of evidence should give journalists the confidence to say where the weight of that evidence lies.
But does it become more
ridiculous.
difficult now for journalists to do that when they're being stretched thinner? They can't spend the
Well,
time.
I mean, I think that why have the press if it is not calling powerful people and institutions to account? What's the point?
We got a few of these. Is journalism becoming exclusively the domain of the wealthy? It's just for those who can afford it.
I think there's an argument to be made that, the popular press in America was conceived by industrialists and capitalists and ideologues, all of whom wanted to project might into the civic common. And there was no, until 1920, 30, 40, newspapers were not really a business. And then they turned into such a good business because of regional monopolies that people had trouble figuring out where to stuff all the money. And that's where investigative reporting came from. That's where a lot of enterprise reporting came down. And now, as that ecosystem is burned down, a lot of what's going on is those that have the money are the ones that can run papers on non-economic terms. In some instances, it works out great. I think part of the reason I was enjoying the Boston Globe this weekend is it has local, dedicated ownership who cares a lot about what happens in this town. But the people of San Diego, which got bought by another rich guy, Doug Manchester, they wouldn't say the same thing. The people in Philly, that ended up being a cat toy between rich people. And if you go to the next tier, which is in terms of who actually is doing the journalism, it all starts out with these unpaid internships that you somehow have to find a way, oftentimes, to live in Manhattan on nothing and fight your way in. Journalism has always been tough to get into, but that economic barrier, I think, is a very significant one.
Jill, you want to?
Yeah, I guess as just a contrarian footnote, I would say that, there is an awful lot of genuinely high-quality journalism, especially available digitally for free, so.
Here's a good question. What is the best journalistic advice you have ever received?
Shut up and listen. If I have a notepad at the reporter.
I've never, when I wrote a book, as you said in the introduction, and you told me at the time, this will be good for you to get covered, to feel what it feels like to be covered. And I learned journalism, very blunt technology, and the people who, as you said, shut up and listen, showed up, asked simple and direct questions, wrote the better stories versus people who showed up and made huge speeches about what I had done. And so that was a good learning, except I had always been a little bit of a speech maker as a reporter. And so it was a brutal lesson to learn that I'd been doing it wrong. I just was talking too much.
I was told, don't take anything personally in the newsroom, which I think was a good piece of advice. And as a 17-year-old intern at All Things Considered, I sat down in Robert Siegel's office and he said, radio sentences should be short, which was a good,
Nice.
good note. How would you write Edward Snowden's obit? What's your lead?
I think that Edward Snowden, in the fullness of time, will be repatriated. People will understand that what he did ended up being an important and necessary step in the evolution of this country, and that he was a necessary figure in our march toward an almost turnkey national security state. I think it was really important for somebody to pull back the blankets, however illegal it was that he did, and point a finger and say, your government is spying at you at every opportunity they can.
I think that's exactly right, and I think a big motivation for Edward Snowden was watching senior government officials, including James Clapper, who he has cited himself, telling lies about the spying and saying it wasn't happening.
What is your opinion of all these fake news shows, Jon Stewart, John Oliver, and others?
I think that Jon Stewart is brilliant, and that if he is your only news source, you actually aren't doing too badly.
I don't agree with you. I think that what he's doing is run its course. I think that John Oliver's show that should be not work once a week, a review, terrible cadence, is doing actual original reporting, going deeper. And I'm not saying Jon Stewart isn't great to watch and stuff, but I have been just fascinated to watch John Oliver's show, which I predicted doom. I just said there's no way that thing could work. And every time I tune in, it's great. And
He really went to town on native advertising,
Oh,
that's
he
for
did.
sure. Took after the New York Times pretty hard.
Yeah, I noticed that. The other thing is, I think I'm kind of a Colbert guy. I just love the trick of it, which is to hear things through a character and process.
I know, how do you think he'll do out of character?
I'm fascinated. It's like, Is he going to be a little bit character, or it's just Steve, or what is going to happen? I don't know. I think it's a great unfolding. I think, and it's great for late night television, which had been, if you think to yourself, it just as we don't see things coming, we'll say, oh, late night television, it's done, right? And then the two Jimmys come up with, I think.
I guess I feel the need to go back to Jon Stewart for a minute, because I don't know if you all saw him go off on the Democrats' big money, fundraising, gorging, disgustingness, but that was pretty dead on.
Yeah, I guess so, and it kind of tilted the rink a little bit, which is what you want in journalism. I mean, it rejoined a discussion that thought was over. So you won yet another one, Jared.
What do you think of online comments on stories?
I've stopped reading them, I have to admit.
I think the beau ideal of the web that we would all play well together, it'd be like a really enlarged Montessori class, and we'd share nicely and talk nicely. If I even veer toward Jon Stewart, or veer towards Bill O'Reilly, or veer towards anything like that, it wasn't that long ago this guy typed me a note and said, I hope you get a really slow developing form of cancer, and your entire family has to watch you die an unmerciful, horrid death. And I just typed back to the guy and said, does your mom know you're talking to strangers like this? It seems weird. It's just like, what? And the thing is, the minute you type back to them, the minute they're not just typing, throwing it down a hole, you let them know there's a person at the other end, they calm right down. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I wish you had cancer. And it's like, do you think you're just sending these missiles out to nowhere? They land on people.
Jill Abramson and David Carr, thank you both so much.